this week I wanted to write a little bit about popular political theories, just because I've seen a lot of false comparisons floating around, and I feel that they're harmful. And I mean, we do this in a lot of arenas, not just politics. You know, we latch onto a term to use as an insult, and we forget what the true meaning of the word is. So I wanted to address something that I've seen floating around recently, just to make things a little clearer. And like I said, in doing the research for this, I went down all sorts of informational rabbit holes. And so if anyone is interested, because I will be doing this reading on my own anyway, if anyone is interested in future For Now posts that delve into any aspect of what I cover today a little bit deeper, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know, whether you DM me here, contact me on Discord, on Twitter. There's also a form at the end of most of my For Now posts, the newer ones. I think the first few do not have this. Just let me know what you want me to write about. I have some general categories listed, but feel free, if there's something specific you want to know, put it in that anything else box and submit it, because I will absolutely focus what I write about on things people are willing to read about. Forget horseshoes and hand grenades. Close only counts in the center. I want to address something that's been bothering me: the prevalence of the idea that the far left and far right are the same. The horseshoe theory is the idea that because both extremes oppose centrists and the capitalist status quo, they must be similar. While that may not be entirely false, there are unquestionable differences between communists and fascists. For starters, communists are anti-fascists. You'd think that would be enough to demonstrate the differences, but apparently not. Communists, whose ideology stems from the idea of structuring society around common ownership of the means of production and the absence of social classes, money, and the state, want to see the needs of all individuals met. Fascism, based more on feelings than philosophy, seeks to make the nation stronger, more powerful, larger, and more successful. Spoiler, this usually only happens at the expense of individuals' well-being and freedoms. Meanwhile, centrists seek to maintain the status quo. As the comrade Kenny has said, liberalism doesn't challenge power, it seeks to accommodate power. Another spoiler: as long as the left isn't allowed into politics, doesn't start a revolution, or doesn't gain power another way, that means centrists accommodate the right. Yes, there have been times the left and right have worked together, notably when Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland. However, as Noah Berlatsky points out, Stalin didn't join with Hitler because he was fascist. He joined with Hitler because he had no particular dislike of anti-Semitism or atrocity, and because it was in his interest to do so. Besides, because of their love for the way things are, centrists have worked with the right far more often. For example, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, granting Hitler part of Czechoslovakia, hoping Hitler would stop there. Obama and Biden advancing corporate interests and contributing to increasing xenophobia and Islamophobia. And the numerous Republicans who seemed perfectly happy with Trumpism, to name a few. Does this mean fishhook theory is right? Fishhook theory suggests that the far right is closer to centrists. That may make us on the left feel better about ourselves, but considering the amount and types of infighting among the left, I'd have to say it's not all that accurate either. Berlatsky proposes tendril theory. The far right is to the far right but fascism sends tendrils across the spectrum. Any two groups of people are going to have similarities and differences because we're all human. I think it's more important to focus on achieving goals that serve humanity rather than to argue about whose beliefs are the same or what labels to call each other. The bottom line, people who support humanity are in line with communist goals. People in favor of increasing the money and power of the nation are in line with fascist goals. The folks sitting back and watching it all, or throwing their hat in for the money and power, are in line with centrist goals. Anyone telling you any of these groups are the same is just wasting your time. I will go into each of these theories a little bit more, just because depending, the average person, if you don't spend a lot of time paying attention to politics, you might not have heard of these before. So I do have these crude illustrations here to show, well, first of all, how these theories got their name. So the horseshoe theory just says that, there's the folks in the center who are looking out at everyone else. The left and the right are just so extreme and so similar in their ideologies, or at least in their actions. They're actually almost the same. And of course, my issue with that is, while some actions and some, individual grievances might be the same, we have very different end goals and, driving forces behind what we want. So Noah Berlatsky, who I quote in my blog post, wrote this article about let's put an end to horseshoe theory once and for all. And I did keep my illustrations a little simple just because they're small and I didn't want to have overlapping text or anything, but he does show the one that points out, the left and the right on each side are kind of in the middle of each arm of the horseshoe, and the ends are the far left and far right. Because there are, like anything else, it's a spectrum. There's, I don't even know all of the labels in between. There's the liberals and the progressives and whoever else that fall in various spots on the spectrum. But it is, it's a little misleading because we, at least in the US, we tend to boil politics down to left versus right. And it's not that simple. But it also, it dominates it either dominates the conversations or it's a theme that drives the conversations. And so I feel it's important to take a look at that and, make sure that we recognize the differences and we're not just saying, oh yeah, left and right. And oh yeah, they're the same. So it's really the left and the right against the center. Like, I don't want to see discourse going that way because it's not true. He does have some more context for where the theory came from. So it was the philosopher Jean-Pierre Fay who looked at, different instances of the left and the right working together, and decided that, horseshoe theory explained that they're not really the opposite ends of a spectrum. They're very close together. And so Berlatsky says, for centrists and for right-wingers, horseshoe theory is a convenient chunk of heavy iron to toss in the faces of left-wing opponents. But its very convenience should be treated with suspicion. Everyone loves to hate the left. But hating the left isn't a good way to fight right-wing extremism. On the contrary, the conflation of alt-right Nazis with a supposed alt-left gives people like President Donald Trump and former Breitbart chairman Steve Bannon rhetorical cover to slime their critics as the real fascists. Perhaps even worse, claiming that the left is especially prone to fascist tendencies allows folks on other parts of the political spectrum to ignore their own complicity when actual fascism crawls out of the mud. which, like I was saying, we kind of throw these terms around when they're convenient for us, but then it hides what, the words lose meaning, and then there's all this confusion about, well, I'm not really a fascist, so what, you must be a fascist for calling me one, without actually giving any thought to what it is that means. I did mention that the argument in horseshoe theory is that the far left and right are, must be the same if they're both opposed to the center. So examples of that are, in the 1930s, both communists and fascists criticized the aging imperial democracies of Britain, France, and the United States as weak, corrupt, and after the Great Depression is hurtling toward a final collapse. More recently, left-wing radicals opposed Hillary Clinton and Emmanuel Macron. And by doing so, they offered de facto and sometimes more than de facto aid to racist nationalist opponents. We are told that left and right both want to destroy democratic norms in the sensible center. Therefore, the horseshoe theory says they work together. And there have been, examples of, like Julian Assange, who, founded WikiLeaks and has been imprisoned, and, I won't get into that whole story. I'm sure most of us have heard what he's been through simply for, exposing information about the U.S. government. But because he hated Clinton, he, reached out to the Trump campaign. And Chelsea Manning, who was at a party with people on the alt-right, which, it happens. She said that she was gathering intelligence, which is, hanging out with the people you need information from is absolutely effective for doing that. But, the pictures can be used for propaganda for the alt-right. And, people are going to believe what they want to believe when they see a photograph like that. And we've been burned by people before, so sometimes it's hard to trust what we're being told. So it certainly can look pretty dire when you look at individual instances like that. But the center does it just as often, if not more often. Whether they're actually, conspiring together or just letting the right do what they want. So there are some more examples here. A center-left pundit, Jonathan Chait, supporting Trump's nomination in the hopes that it would hurt the Republican Party. Because something centrists will do is, because they want things to stay the same, they'll often throw bones to whoever's, pushing them for any kind of change, right? I mentioned in the article about Prime Minister Chamberlain granting Hitler part of Czechoslovakia, hoping that Hitler would stop at that point, when in reality, Hitler actually went and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. I don't know why I have such a hard time saying that. Czechoslovakia. And then went on to invade Poland after that. And it wasn't until 2 days later that England finally declared war. But yeah, Chamberlain was hoping that, he'll be happy with the part of Czechoslovakia where the Germans were living at that time, because it had formerly been a part of Germany. So he thought, we'll throw him this bone and he'll be happy. Much like Biden has done, right? This last summer, and so Brianna Joy Gray, who was a former formerly on Bernie Sanders' campaign, wrote this article last summer. And, it talks about how maybe we should have been a little bit more discerning as far as the Democratic nominee, and how, basically the whole vote blue no matter who was the dominating rally cry, when in reality, the protests were going on, and folks on the left had some leverage before Biden was elected, to try and get the Democrats to, agree to things that would actually serve the vast majority of Americans. But because the narrative was vote blue no matter who, we lost that power. And there are a lot of highlights in here, so it might take me a moment to find the one I'm particularly thinking of. Well, I can go through. I'll touch on it at some point reading through this. But the thing with what I mentioned about centrists, kind of being happy with the status quo. So, and here's another thing about language and using it in ways that aren't necessarily accurate. I've been saying centrist, and to be honest, this was kind of a late realization, so I didn't change the language in my blog post, and it's definitely something I want to dive into a little bit more. So there is actually a centrist party. It sounds a lot like what I've been saying about the center, but perhaps moderate is a more accurate description for the center itself when I'm not referring specifically to the party. But I did come across their website, and they say that centrism is a political ideology based on reason and pragmatism, which I bring up because that's one of the Democrats' arguments, right? So Brianna was saying that the idea that voters only cared about beating Trump led journalists to assess candidates through that lens almost exclusively. And in doing so, they collapsed important distinctions between candidates that voters might have cared about had they been made clear. And this is a problem inherent to vote blue no matter who. It can lead us to substitute pragmatic or normative arguments for moral ones, and in so doing, demote the substantive ethical considerations that should be driving our decision-making. It blurs the line between accepting a bad outcome and validating an unacceptable one, making bad outcomes more likely to come to pass. I think I touched upon it in an earlier post, and I cannot recall now what post that might have been. I think, unless it might actually be in my glossary, now that I'm thinking of it. I'm thinking of the Overton window, which is another one of those phrases that if you haven't informed yourself very much about politics, you might not have heard of. But it's the idea that acceptable politics shift over time. Oh, here it is. Okay. So the Overton window, also called the window of discourse, and I'm giving you the context for this. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but if it's something you'd like to learn more about, absolutely let me know. I can get into it. So the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. Joseph P. Overton described a spectrum from more free to less free with regard to government intervention. It's oriented vertically on an axis to avoid comparison with the left-right political spectrum. So it goes up and down. And the thing, if you look at US politics more recently, because obviously, as we know, if we go further back, the Democrats and Republicans had wildly different views than they each hold today. But we do have the tendency to go back and forth between the two, right? From, we have a Democratic president for a while, and then we have a Republican, and then we go back to a Democratic president. And the problem here is that, when we have the Democratic president who's, more often than not interested in maintaining the status quo, when folks aren't happy with how that's going, we end up with the Republican president who wants to push things to the right. Again, generally speaking. And I'm using generalities because I have not done the deep dive into all of our presidents. I'm not going to try and speak on specifics in this one general example. But so we go from, a status quo president to one who wants to push things to the right some. But then, we get scared and say, oh, well, we don't really want to head off towards that direction, so let's elect a centrist. Well, the thing with the status quo is that's how things are now, which means once we've had a Republican president who's pushed us more to the right, that's the new status quo, which will maintain until the next Republican president, which means that acceptable politics keeps shifting right without, having progressives or, the far left have any power in our government, which is probably why there was a lot of excitement about the Squad, and about, a handful of other folks who have made it into office, pushing progressive policies. And how now that, some, if not all of them, have proven that, they're going to go along with the party lines, that's a little disappointing because the party's not interested in progressive actions. But so generally the idea of the Overton window is that, things that used to be considered center are now left because we're slowly shifting to the right. But because of the idea of the Overton window, we can shift back to the left. It's just a matter of what is, what is acceptable and what can, be perceived as acceptable. Anyway, so that's kind of, underlying a lot of my thoughts as I was reading this, was the whole idea that, as we slowly push right, and, that might seem to argue for fishhook theory, right? As the center keeps realigning further and further right, and the left really isn't moving. We want everyone to be well. We want everyone's basic needs to be met. I hate thinking that that's an extreme idea, but I mean, how do you get more extreme? We're not going anywhere. This is what we're asking for, and it seems everyone else gets caught up on the right side of things. So yeah, remember what I was saying about getting down informational rabbit holes. I don't know that I finished my thoughts over here with this article, but this is literally what my research looks like. I think, oh, how about this idea? And I go Google something else. And again, if anyone has questions, comments, arguments, feel free, as long as you're, I expect all sorts of arguments when I bring up stuff like this. As long as you're respectful, you follow my rules, I am happy to engage in any discourse. But yeah, because I don't pretend to be any kind of expert on this. I get an idea in my head and I want to learn more about it, so I research it and then I share what I learn. But I think it's important too to have different voices in every conversation, because, you know, I go into this, and I noticed it too as I was choosing what to highlight. I go into this with my own set of biases. And, you know, being on the left myself, obviously, I'm going to prefer information that makes me sound better and right, as in correct, not on the right. And, you know, so there are some arguments in some of what I've read that, you know, especially, you know, looking at the times that the left and the right have worked together, and it's true. And because going back to, I'm sorry if I'm switching between screens too much and like dizzying people, let me know. I'll try to slow that down. To be honest, tendril theory isn't necessarily hasn't necessarily taken hold. This is the first time I had heard any reference to this. I think this was something he thought of while he was writing the article. It holds some level of truth, you know, because the political spectrum isn't anything new. And the right is labeled fascism because that's how he labeled it in his original drawing that he did in the article, which I can show you is in here somewhere. So this is his tendril theory, which I tried to recreate a little easier to read for my article. But considering, you know, a lot of us have noticed on Twitter, on Twitch, that there are people who claim to be on the left who also, you know, they claim things or try to explain things that, you know, lean towards fascism, if not aren't outright ideas supporting fascism. And, you know, whether or not tendril theory actually holds water, there's a part of it that's appealing because it kind of illustrates how pervasive fascism can be, especially in a place like the US, where we've been socialized. I know I keep bringing this up, but it underlies everything. I mean, we've been socialized into this capitalistic, white supremacist society. And those things were created so that certain people could keep power. And if you recall, you know, fascism is all about making the nation more powerful, among the other things, you know, being wealthier, bigger, more successful. But fascists seek power. Capitalists seek money and power. It's all connected. And when you've been socialized to believe that those ideas are the norm and what we're supposed to be working towards, you know, even as you become radicalized towards the left, like, you have to shed that training, you have to shed that socialization, and it doesn't happen all at once. I mean, especially if you've been radicalized later in life. I mean, I've been disillusioned with U.S. politics for quite some time, but it wasn't until last year that, you know, I really started to understand why that was, and really started to understand, you know, where I fell on the spectrum, to understand the ideologies behind the left and the right and all that. So, you know, for someone who spent almost 4 decades not questioning what I'd been socialized to believe without question, you know, it takes some time to shed all of that, even with the best intentions. And so people might want to be on the left. They might want to claim that, you know, I've rejected all fascism. And especially, I mean, I'm sure most of us have seen things that have been floating around Twitter very recently, about the reformed fascists. And that's, I feel like there's a couple of levels to that, at the very least. but, we might sincerely want to be on the left. Whether, we identify as progressive or communist or something else. But until we learn about and accept and face the fascism that we've been socialized into, we can't let it all go because, we don't know what we're trying to let go. So I feel like it's important. And again, I ended up, one of the articles I found is What is Fascism? And it's a bit of a long read, but I learned a lot, and I used tiny little tidbits in my article, but I'm thinking I'm going to write another for now solely about fascism, just because there was so much information in here and the highlights are not loading, but I learned a lot reading this article, and there's no way I'd be able to get into all of it. And even, like I said, I'm just learning this as I go, so I don't even I haven't had the time to sit back and let it all kind of coalesce in my mind to fully understand everything that I've read. But there are a lot of good points about the whole idea that it's hard to define fascism because there's so many definitions. And just the whole idea that fascist has become an insult. So it gets thrown around a lot without necessarily having anything to do with anyone really being a fascist. But it does lay out some core elements that you find, and it's definitely something I want to get into a little bit more for the sake of, being able to understand it and recognize it and, have useful conversations without getting sidetracked by someone trying to use it inappropriately. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing details about that, let me know. Yeah, I don't want to get too deep down if anyone still has questions or comments they want to share about everything I just threw at you. But if you do want to read more, everything I've shared so far has been from these For Later articles that I link right in the blog post.